Post-war Britain was a society that rigidly clung to the gallows as its ultimate deterrent, an era deeply unforgiving toward the transgressions of women. It seems an unlikely setting for a crime of such quiet, devastating calculation on a peaceful Easter Sunday. Yet, when a young woman fired multiple shots into her lover outside a London pub, the true mystery was never who pulled the trigger. The chilling enigma is why she stood perfectly still to await the authorities, and why she later deliberately uttered the exact words required to guarantee her own tragic execution. Easter Sunday, April 10, 1955, began as a day of traditional quietude and religious observance across the British capital. The streets of Hampstead, an affluent and picturesque residential neighbourhood in London, were bathed in the soft, fading light of a crisp spring evening. Locals had gathered inside the warm, wood-panelled walls of the Magdala pub, their laughter and overlapping conversations spilling out onto the pavement whenever the heavy oak doors swung open. It was a picture of post-war domestic tranquility, a peaceful urban landscape completely unprepared for the violence that was about to unfold on its doorstep. Stepping out into the cool night air was 25-year-old David Blakely. A charismatic, thrill-seeking race car driver, Blakely navigated the world with a reckless confidence that naturally drew people toward him. He had spent the evening drinking and socializing with friends, stepping out of the pub entirely oblivious to the figure waiting patiently for him in the encroaching darkness. Standing just outside the glow of the street lamps was 28-year-old Ruth Ellis. Dressed sharply, her platinum blonde hair catching the faint ambient light, she did not look like a woman teetering on the precipice of madness. She looked entirely resolute. As Blakely moved toward his parked car, Ruth stepped out of the shadows, deliberately blocking his path. There was no screaming match, no desperate final plea for his affection to alert the bystanders to the impending danger. Instead, Ruth raised her hand, revealing a heavy .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. The first deafening crack of the firearm violently shattered the peaceful quiet of the Hampstead street. Blakely stumbled, his confident demeanor vanishing in an instant as the heavy projectile struck him. Desperate, terrified, and bleeding, he attempted to flee, scrambling frantically around the vehicles parked heavily along the curb. But Ruth pursued him with a chilling, mechanical precision. She fired again and then again. The heavy revolver bucked in her hands as she discharged the weapon into her fleeing lover, the gunshots echoing like cannon fire against the brick facades of the surrounding buildings. By the time the hammer finally clicked against an empty chamber, David Blakely lay motionless on the cobblestones, his life rapidly bleeding out into the London street. Inside the Magdala, the cheerful holiday chatter had abruptly devolved into stunned, breathless silence, followed swiftly by the chaotic clamor of panicked patrons ducking for cover beneath the tables. The air outside grew thick with the acrid metallic stench of cordite. In the immediate aftermath of such sudden, brutal violence, human instinct typically dictates a frantic escape. A killer drops the smoking weapon, vanishes into the night, and evades capture for as long as possible. Ruth Ellis did no such thing. She lowered the empty revolver and stood perfectly still beside the shattered body of the man she loved. When an off-duty policeman, drawn by the sudden eruption of gunfire, cautiously approached the bloody scene, he fully expected to find a hysterical woman or a fleeing suspect. Instead, he found Ruth standing in a state of unnatural, almost statuesque calmness. She made no attempt to conceal the Smith & Wesson, nor did she offer a frantic, tearful alibi. With a quiet, steady voice that entirely belied the gruesome carnage at her feet, she simply looked at the officer and asked him to arrest her. She offered no resistance, no tears, and no visible remorse. To the arriving detectives who rushed to cordon off the blood-stained pavement, this was not a mystery requiring complex deduction. Her bizarre lack of emotion painted the absolute picture of a calculated, cold-blooded killer who had executed her target with ruthless efficiency. To the police, it was an open and shut case of a jealous lover seeking revenge. But the pristine crime scene hid a horrific, invisible pattern of abuse. To understand the chilling tableau outside the Magdala, one must look backward, peering into the claustrophobic and deeply destructive romance that consumed Ruth Ellis and David Blakely. Their relationship was not built on mutual respect, but rather forged in a chaotic crucible of intense passion, heavy drinking, and brutal jealousy. From the moment they met in the hazy, smoke-filled clubs of 1950s London, they were locked in a volatile orbit. It was a whirlwind affair defined by dizzying highs and terrifying lows, where blind infatuation frequently gave way to screaming matches that echoed through the thin walls of their shared spaces. At the center of this storm was David Blakely, a man whose undeniable charisma masked a profoundly manipulative and cruel nature. To the outside world, he was a dashing, well-mannered race car driver with a bright future and a magnetic smile. Behind closed doors, however, he meticulously dismantled Ruth's self-worth. He constantly undermined her, feeding her insecurities while simultaneously relying on her for financial support when his racing ambitions failed to pay the bills. He treated her with a toxic mixture of possessiveness and disdain, keeping her trapped in a perpetual state of emotional whiplash. Over time, this insidious psychological manipulation metastasized into outright physical violence. Friends, neighbors, and later, witnesses testifying in police reports would paint a harrowing picture of the horrors occurring away from the public eye. Accounts detailed Ruth frequently appearing with mysterious bruises, her platinum hair hastily styled to conceal the marks of Blakely's sudden, explosive rages. He would strike her during drunken altercations, only to return hours later with tearful apologies and hollow promises of reform. It was a textbook cycle of abuse, yet in a society that largely viewed domestic disputes as strictly private matters, Ruth was entirely isolated, drowning in a nightmare from which she felt there was no escape. The fragile dynamic finally shattered completely just 10 days before the fatal gunfire on Easter Sunday. During the final weekend of March 1955, the couple engaged in a particularly ferocious argument. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, Blakely lunged at Ruth and delivered a devastating, full-force punch directly to her stomach. The sheer brutality of the blow would be horrifying under any circumstance, but it carried a uniquely tragic weight. Ruth Ellis was pregnant with Blakely's child. The blunt force trauma from the violent assault triggered a severe medical crisis, ultimately causing Ruth to suffer a painful and traumatic miscarriage. The loss of her unborn child utterly destroyed whatever remained of Ruth's psychological stability. She was left to grapple not only with the profound physical agony of the miscarriage, but with an overwhelming, consuming grief that Blakely callously ignored. Friends noted a dark, irreversible shift in her demeanor following the tragedy. The vibrant, sharp-witted woman had been hollowed out, replaced by an empty shell vibrating with unresolved trauma and deep-seated despair. She had been physically battered, emotionally annihilated, and violently stripped of her motherhood by the very man she had sacrificed everything to support. She was entirely broken, grieving, and pushed far beyond the absolute edge of human endurance. To any modern observer, Ruth Ellis was a victim of severe domestic terror who had finally snapped under unbearable pressure. But when she eventually stood before the stern faces of the judge and jury, she would quickly learn a terrifying truth. The rigid courts of 1950s Britain didn't care about her bruised body, her psychological collapse, or her dead child. They only cared about her intent. To truly comprehend the catastrophic nature of Ruth's impending trial, we must momentarily step away from the fog-choked streets of 1950s London and examine her actions through the lens of modern psychological jurisprudence. Today, particularly within the United States legal system, we possess a formalized scientific vocabulary for the specific brand of invisible horror she endured. It is known clinically and legally as Battered Woman Syndrome. First identified by psychologists in the late 20th century, this condition develops when a victim of severe, ongoing domestic abuse feels entirely trapped within a cyclical nightmare of violence. Stripped of their autonomy, isolated from support networks, and conditioned by relentless physical and emotional terror, the victim often perceives an omnipresent, inescapable threat to their very survival. They exist in a state of hyper-arousal, eventually acting out of extreme, prolonged fear rather than calculating malice. If the tragic case of Ruth Ellis were to unfold in a modern American courtroom, the narrative presented to a jury would be fundamentally transformed. Defense attorneys would systematically dismantle the image of a cold-blooded, jealous lover, replacing it with the harrowing reality of systematic psychological destruction. Expert psychiatric witnesses would take the stand to heavily contextualize the Easter Sunday shooting. They would point directly to the horrific catalyst, the brutal punch to the abdomen, and the agonizing, subsequent miscarriage, not as a distant memory, but as the definitive breaking point for a mind already pushed to the brink of collapse. Under contemporary United States law, this extensive history of intimate partner violence would be admitted as a crucial mitigating factor. A modern jury, equipped with a comprehensive understanding of trauma responses, would be asked to view her actions through the prism of diminished capacity, temporary insanity, or even a preemptive form of self-defense. In all probability, the prosecution's demand for a first-degree capital murder conviction would fail, and Ruth would face a charge of voluntary manslaughter, a verdict carrying a chance at psychiatric rehabilitation and life after prison. However, the archaic machinery of the 1950s British justice system possessed no such psychological nuance. The law during this rigid, post-war era operated on a strict, black and white spectrum that left absolutely no room for the messy, invisible complexities of domestic trauma. To claim provocation under the legal statutes of the time, a defendant had to definitively prove that their retaliatory violence was an immediate, spontaneous reaction to a sudden insult or injury. Crucially, the law relied on the concept of a cooling-off period. Because Ruth had suffered the fatal blow and the miscarriage days prior to the murder, and because she had purposefully walked to the Magdala pub carrying a loaded Smith & Wesson revolver, the law classified her actions as meticulously premeditated. The British courts entirely dismissed the cumulative, suffocating weight of her prolonged abuse. In the eyes of the 1950s legal establishment, the concept of a battered woman did not exist. They saw only a rational, scorned woman who had planned an execution with malice aforethought. It was a profound, fatal legal blind spot that fundamentally doomed victims of domestic terror to the gallows. The inflexible parameters of British law ensured that the very trauma that shattered Ruth's mind was deemed legally inadmissible as an adequate defense for her actions. As Ruth Ellis was transported from her holding cell to the imposing oak-paneled courtroom of the Old Bailey to face her judges, she was walking into a judicial arena that had already actively erased her victimhood. Armed with this modern understanding of her psychological collapse and the insurmountable legal walls closing in around her, the stage is now set for what remains one of the most agonizing legal proceedings in history. When she finally took the witness stand, the prosecution laid a deadly, calculated trap concerning her intent, and instead of fighting for her life, the broken woman willingly stepped right into it. In late June 1955, the imposing stone facade of London's Central Criminal Court, globally recognized as the Old Bailey, became the epicenter of a ravenous media circus. The streets surrounding the courthouse were utterly paralyzed by throngs of eager onlookers, aggressive reporters, and flashing camera bulbs. The British press, historically relentless in its pursuit of scandal, had already tried and convicted the defendant in the court of public opinion. They ruthlessly stripped away the horrific context of her domestic abuse, choosing instead to brand the 28-year-old grieving mother with a much more salacious moniker, the Blonde Temptress. As Ruth Ellis was led into the dock, dressed immaculately in a fitted black suit and a freshly dyed platinum coiffure, the stage was set for a highly publicized legal slaughter. Inside the solemn oak-paneled courtroom, Ruth's defense counsel faced a virtually insurmountable legal wall. They desperately attempted to save her from the gallows by arguing the defense of provocation, hoping to legally reduce the capital murder charge to a lesser conviction of manslaughter. To succeed, they had to convince the jury that the severe physical abuse, the violent punch, and the subsequent traumatic miscarriage had driven her temporarily out of her mind. However, as previously established, the rigid laws of the 1950s demanded that provocation be an instantaneous reaction to an assault. Because Ruth had walked the distance to the Magdala pub and waited with a loaded weapon, the prosecution easily argued that a fatal cooling-off period had occurred. The defense's desperate narrative of a woman driven entirely mad by abuse was systematically dismantled by the rigid technicalities of the era's legal code. The trial ultimately reached its agonizing, historic climax during the prosecution's cross-examination. Leading the charge for the Crown was Christmas Humphreys, an exceptionally experienced and formidable prosecuting attorney, who understood exactly how narrow the legal definition of murder truly was. Humphreys did not need to prove that Ruth was a monster. He merely needed to prove that she possessed malice aforethought, the specific legal intent to end a human life. He approached the witness stand with clinical precision, laying a devastating verbal trap that offered the fragile defendant absolutely no avenue of escape. Humphreys locked eyes with Ruth and asked a single, direct question regarding her mindset at the exact moment she pulled the trigger. The courtroom held its collective breath, waiting for the defense's carefully coached denials or a tearful plea of temporary insanity. Instead, displaying the same chilling, statuesque calmness she had shown the arresting officer on Easter Sunday, Ruth leaned into the microphone. She delivered what would instantly become the most famous, devastating line in modern British legal history. It was obvious that when I shot him, I intended to kill him. That single, unadorned sentence acted as an atomic bomb dropped into the hushed silence of the Old Bailey. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. In an instant, she had completely obliterated her own defense. But a deeper analysis of this historic moment reveals that this was not the arrogant boast of a cold-blooded killer. It was the ultimate, tragic surrender of a woman who had simply given up. Ruth Ellis was completely emotionally hollowed out, entirely consumed by grief for her unborn child, and paradoxically, for the abusive man she had killed. By speaking those exact words to Humphreys, she deliberately sealed her own death warrant. In her fractured psychological state, she genuinely believed that a life for a life was the only fair exchange, deciding that she deserved to die for taking the life of the man she loved. With her murderous intent firmly and legally established from her own lips, the trial's conclusion was reduced to a mere grim formality. The jury retired to deliberate, but the sheer, overwhelming weight of her courtroom confession meant their discussion was brief. They returned to the courtroom just 14 minutes later with a unanimous verdict: guilty of murder. In accordance with the unbending laws of the land, the presiding judge solemnly placed the traditional square of black silk, the black cap, upon his wig. He looked down at the pale, motionless woman in the dock and officially sentenced Ruth Ellis to hang by the neck until dead. The court had spoken, and the unyielding machinery of British justice had been set into motion, but the British public was about to erupt. As the sweltering heat of July 1955 settled over London, the unforgiving reality of the death sentence loomed over the condemned cell at Holloway Prison. Inside, Ruth Ellis awaited her fate with the exact same unnerving tranquility she had displayed since the gunfire ceased on Easter Sunday. Outside those thick stone walls, however, a seismic shift was occurring in the British consciousness. The sensationalist press, which had so eagerly vilified her as a ruthless, calculating femme fatale, suddenly pivoted as the grim reality of hanging a 28-year-old mother began to sink in. The tide of public opinion turned violently from righteous condemnation to desperate, overwhelming sympathy. A massive, frantic grassroots campaign mobilized across the country, culminating in a historic petition bearing no less than 50,000 signatures. It was rushed directly to the desk of Home Secretary Gwilym Lloyd George, begging for an 11th-hour reprieve and a measure of clemency for a woman who had been so thoroughly broken by domestic terror. Yet, the political establishment remained entirely immovable. To the conservative forces governing post-war Britain, granting a reprieve to a woman who had so publicly and admittedly executed her lover would undermine the very foundation of capital punishment. The gallows were viewed as the ultimate deterrent, a necessary, unyielding pillar of law and order that could not be allowed to bend to public sentiment or psychological nuance. Gwilym Lloyd George officially denied the petition. The political decision was ruthlessly clear. The government would not be swayed by emotion or the mitigating factors of her abuse. Ruth Ellis was to be made a stark, uncompromising example. Her life forfeit to preserve the terrifying, absolute authority of the state, with the date irrevocably set. The grim logistics of death fell to the most prolific and famous hangman in British history, Albert Pierrepoint. Coming from a long, dark family legacy of executioners, Pierrepoint had elevated the grim business of hanging to a chilling, calculated science. He approached his solemn duty with a cold, precise methodology, completely devoid of personal malice, hesitation, or judgment. Days before the scheduled execution, he discreetly observed Ruth in her cell to estimate her weight and physical build. He factored these variables into his meticulous mathematical formulas to determine the exact length of the rope's drop, ensuring the force would be sufficient to cause instantaneous dislocation of the cervical vertebrae. Pierrepoint operated with terrifying clinical efficiency, famously capable of moving a condemned prisoner from their holding cell to the fatal trapdoor in a matter of mere seconds. The morning of Wednesday, July 13, 1955, dawned with a heavy, oppressive gloom. Inside Holloway Prison, the final hours ticked away toward the scheduled 9:00 a.m. execution. When Pierrepoint and the attending prison officials entered the condemned cell, they did not find a hysterical woman pleading for her life, nor did they face the desperate thrashing of someone fighting the inevitable end. Instead, Ruth Ellis greeted her executioner with profound, quiet dignity. She had long since accepted her fate, embracing the gallows not as a state-sanctioned punishment, but as a tragic absolution for the life she had taken. She offered absolutely no resistance as Pierrepoint moved seamlessly behind her, his practiced hands swiftly securing the leather pinioning straps around her wrists and arms to bind her for the final walk. A profound, suffocating silence descended upon the execution chamber as Ruth was led the few short steps to the gallows. She stepped onto the wooden trapdoor with a haunting serenity as the white hood was drawn over her head and the noose adjusted. But this clinical, hushed efficiency stood in violent, jarring contrast to the chaotic scene erupting just beyond the prison walls. Outside the towering gates of Holloway, a massive crowd of hundreds had gathered in the morning light. They were not a bloodthirsty mob seeking entertainment, but a roaring, weeping congregation of ordinary citizens. As the clock struck 9, an agonizing collective wail rose from the street. Men and women openly sobbed, their voices thick with helpless outrage. When the official paper notice of execution was finally pinned to the heavy wooden doors, confirming that the sentence had been carried out, the crowd surged forward. They hammered their fists against the unyielding timber of the prison gates, their frantic banging echoing through the London streets. A visceral, desperate protest against a justice system that had just hanged a broken woman. When the trapdoor fell at Holloway Prison, it secured Ruth Ellis a permanent, deeply somber place in history. She became the last woman ever to be executed in the United Kingdom. However, rather than neatly closing a dark chapter of criminality, as the government had intended, her death fundamentally haunted the national conscience. The creeping realization that the state had systematically hanged a grieving, battered mother, a woman visibly broken by severe domestic terror and the traumatic loss of her unborn child, brutally exposed the archaic, barbaric nature of the gallows. The British public, who had initially consumed her trial as a salacious tabloid spectacle, was ultimately left grappling with a profound, lingering sense of moral revulsion. This visceral, widespread outrage did not simply fade into the forgotten annals of true crime history. The tragedy of Ruth Ellis became the definitive catalyst that ignited a ferocious, nationwide abolitionist movement. Activists, legal scholars, and ordinary citizens alike pointed to her doomed trial as the ultimate, tragic proof that the rigid, black and white parameters of capital punishment could never adequately administer true justice or account for the invisible scars of psychological trauma. This relentless socio-political pressure directly paved the way for a monumental legal revolution. Exactly a decade after her execution, the British Parliament passed the Murder Act of 1965, formally stripping the executioner of their duties and effectively ending the death penalty in Britain forever. Looking back at the quiet, cobblestone streets of Hampstead on that fateful Easter Sunday, the chilling enigma introduced at the beginning of our story finally unravels. When Ruth stood perfectly still over the shattered body of David Blakely, patiently waiting for the authorities to arrive, her unnatural calmness was not the hallmark of cold-blooded, calculated malice. It was the absolute, hollow resignation of a woman who had already been entirely destroyed long before she ever pulled the trigger. She did not run from the police because in her traumatized mind there was nowhere left to escape to. Her spirit had been systematically dismantled behind closed doors months before the state ever readied the noose. Her enduring legacy leaves us to wrestle with a deeply uncomfortable question that still reverberates through modern courtrooms. Where exactly do we draw the line between righteous justice and institutional vengeance, especially when the defendant standing in the dock is a traumatized survivor of intimate partner abuse? What are your thoughts on how the modern justice system handles domestic abuse survivors today? Leave a comment below with your perspective. If you found this historical deep dive compelling, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a like, and share the video to help others find the show. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next case.